sometimes kids will experience a loss and they really are okay. The other end of that is when loss is just felt really deeply and kids don't have the words for it. So it's common to see like regressions in behavior, like kids might act much younger than, before the loss happened as a way to get their needs met.
Hi, Dana. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. I'm excited for this conversation. Um, we'll dive right in, but maybe to set the context for our conversation, could you tell us a little bit about your background and the work that you do currently?
Definitely. So I am a registered social worker and I work in private practice as a therapist. I work with children, youth, families, and adults. And a big part of my work is supporting folks with relationships and attachment trauma.
Cool. And what sort of motivated or inspired you to get into that work?
Wow, that's a big question. Uh, how far back do you want to go?
As far as you want. Um, were there particular events, or was there like a core motivation behind getting into that kind of work?
Yeah, so it was I guess in some ways it was kind of a linear progression in my career to become a therapist, but it was also really not linear. So um, it had lots of twists and turns and kind of just rolling with opportunities available to me. But I became a social worker because when I was in high school, I had the privilege of meeting a youth worker that was assigned to some of the kids that I was hanging out with, and um, just being able to see the impact that she had on their lives was really big for me. So these were kids that had experienced a lot of loss, abandonment, and kind of really didn't have a place in the world. But when she was with them, like it just the way that she interacted with them, it's like you could tell, like that they were whole in that moment, right? It's like that feeling of being seen and being valued and being important really shone through. And yeah, I thought, well, I want to do that. Like I want to work with youth. And so I got into social work thinking I would work with youth transitioning out of foster care and into adulthood, and ended up taking some twists and turns, ended up in a school program working with junior high kids. And then from there, I just wanted to kind of learn more and get more skills to be a really good helper. And I ended up going back to university, did my master's in with a clinical specialization, and from there went on into the world of therapy and counseling.
That's cool. I actually had a very similar experience. I took a peer counseling class in high school, and the gentleman who was like our the head school counselor, had a massive impact on my life. So I can
Oh,
relate to that
amazing.
very much. Yeah. Um, why did you choose to focus on therapy and working with families and youth and going into sort of private practice?
Yeah. Why did I? I think it was a natural progression. I ended up doing play therapy, so I have some advanced training in play therapy, because that's really the language that kids speak. It's not words. It's play. It's toy. It's behavioral. So, as a play therapist, my training really focused on working with kids one on one, and after doing that for a few years, while also working with adults at the same time, I realized it really doesn't make any sense to work with kids one on one. A lot of the trauma work I do with adults are around healing that inner child. And so it made sense to me to work with parents and kids together, so that parents can be healing that child in real time, I guess. Um, but so yeah, that just is way more fulfilling to me than working with kids one on one. It's like really seeing that early intervention happen.
Yeah. Seems like all roads lead back to our inner child. I've even in some of
Yeah.
the work with my therapist, I'm like, how does my teenage daughter have the ability to trigger me more than anyone I've ever met in my entire life? And she's like, oh, it's because you identify with something at that period of your life that you find very triggering. And it's, yeah, it's so funny.
Yes, yeah, it's
Yeah.
amazing when we start to figure out all of those pieces, those reactions that we have, and how far back they go.
100%. Yeah. I always, after yoga or meditation, I always honor my daughter as being my awakener. So,
Hmm.
yeah. So I imagine that your line of work can be very emotionally challenging at times. What are some of the
Hmm.
things you do to protect yourself while sort of remaining open and empathetic with your clients?
Hmm. Well, one of the most life-altering thing that I've done to support myself is actually choosing a therapy model that privileges the positive. So, and it also privileges the relationship. And so, I guess what I mean by that is, as I'm talking with someone, um, we're talking about, the feelings and the emotions that are coming up for them, but I'm also encouraged as a therapist to self-disclose what impact my client is having on me. And that can create some really kind of magical moments and opportunities for us to both sit with and experience the positive change that we're feeling together. And that's really different from a lot of traditional talk therapy, where the onus is on the therapist to like give good advice and figure all of this stuff out. So since changing the way that I work, I feel so much more grounded in my day to day and really supported. But over and above that, I guess I'm a little bit selfish in my free time. So I have surrounded myself with animals. I have a horse, I have a dog. I'm very, I guess, physically active, and I have a really great supportive husband who I've trained over the years to be really empathetic and turn off that fix it mode. That was a big thing that we used to run into a lot, where I would need someone at the end of the day just to share a little bit about what was going on for me. And, the advice that he was giving was not needed and probably not super appropriate because he doesn't have training in my line of work.
Yeah.
So,
That's
yeah.
something I've heard from my wife too, is it seems like I'm always eager to jump in and try and fix things, and it's like often she just needs me to sit there and listen attentively and empathize. It doesn't need fixing. Yeah, so I
And
can
I can
relate.
totally relate, though, I have to say, when I'm at home, like my therapist hat comes off, and I'm probably even worse than my husband Sean is for that. Like, he'll vent about something, and I'll jump into solutions, and it's hard not to do that. I think because we want to help.
It is. Yeah, for sure. So what I'm hearing is that on the personal side, you really do have to make sure that you're doing things that are very recharging and fulfilling for you and help to, I don't know, rebuild
Mhm.
your energy supplies, I suppose.
Yeah, I think being really mindful, I love that. Yeah, that concept of like managing my energy, and, as helpers, like being mindful to manage our energy, because it's easy to say yes sometimes and, find ourselves overextended. And sometimes it's harder to say no, but being in the groove of saying no can be really liberating. So,
It's very empowering, actually. And I heard
yeah.
a quote on a podcast recently. It was like, if I can't trust your no, how can I trust your yes? And I thought that was a really
Mm,
interesting concept where being clear and just like really shamelessly honest about what you actually want
mm-hmm,
almost like trains people to really trust what you say. So like if you say no and you're okay with saying no, it's
mm-hmm.
like when you say yes, it means even more. So anyway, just a little bit of a tangent,
Yeah.
but
Well, there's nothing worse than having two indecisive people together. That just comes to
yeah.
my mind.
Yeah, for sure. Running in circles sometimes. I find I get that way when I'm really tired. I just like
Yeah.
I don't want to make any more decisions, and yeah, we can run in circles with my wife, but circling back, so this model of therapy that you use sounds like you're given almost like permission and space to be vulnerable within the context of the session, and that sounds maybe like in almost like opposition with a lot of the therapy
Mm,
that I've personally experienced and the models and frameworks that I'm familiar with.
hmm.
Could you unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, yeah. One of the sayings that we have is the therapist should be brave and the client safe.
Mm,
So it's the responsibility of the therapist to create that safe space and container. And it's also our responsibility to be brave in how we're, you know, approaching our work. So I think vulnerability and courage really go hand in hand, or bravery. So yeah, so the model that I use, it's a mouthful, both of the models I I focus on. Um, it's AEDP, so accelerated experiential dynamic psychotherapy is how I practice with adults and some of my teens or young adults. And then with families, I practice DDP, which is dyadic
mhm.
developmental psychotherapy. And I know this is like psychobabble, so I apologize to everyone out there, but um, they really complement each other, and I find that they're very similar, and it really bridges I'm like, how do I say this? It bridges the work that I do with adults with my family. Like it's just developmentally sensitive to, like, kids ages and stages and how they talk about things. So that's kind of cool. I don't know, I probably took us really off topic there for a
No, no,
second.
no, that's cool. That actually is an interesting segue to something that's like personal for me. Is the recent experience of losing my mom made it obvious to me that kids and adults process loss differently. What are
Hmm.
some of the common behaviors that you see in kids and youth, if we want to separate them into those two buckets, around, I don't know, grief or loss or trauma, however you want to frame that?
Hmm. Yeah, and it varies so much, just as it varies in adults as well, how we respond to a loss. And, the two ends of the spectrum, sometimes kids will experience a loss and they really are okay.
Mm,
And, the parents or the adults in their life are really concerned about the impact it has on the kid, but sometimes a loss is just, it's okay. Like, to know that, hey, this person was in my life and now they're not. Um, And I'm talking more probably about extended family members than, something so close to home as a parent.
mhm,
Um, but the other end of that is when loss is just felt really deeply and kids don't have the words for it. So it's common to see like regressions in behavior, like kids might act much younger than, before the loss happened, as a way to get their needs met, for like nurturing and comfort and being soothed. Like that's a really adaptive behavior, is actually for a kid to act much younger than they are chronologically. But it's looked at like, this really kind of scary or bad thing. Like my kids lost these skills and abilities that they had before, and all of a sudden they're baby talking. But no, like this is a child that's communicating, I need your comfort and support. um, you might see more like meltdowns, more anger, I think is just the most misunderstood reaction to grief. And it's so natural that at some point we're going to be hit with that anger of, why did this happen, or why me, or angry at ourselves. Like kids, teens, sometimes will blame themselves for what happened. And, why didn't I do something to stop it? Or if only I'd done this thing, this wouldn't have happened.
yeah.
Yeah.
So some regret in there too, potentially, could fuel that
Hmm.
behavior. I know that was something that we saw at home, was like, "Oh, I wish I had done this. I wish I hadn't done this," kind of thing. Um, Being, I guess, reflective of the circumstance, which I think can be hard for a lot of people to even have that perspective, let alone kids and youth. But
Yeah, and I
yeah,
think kids are more prone to like magical thinking about it. So I probably hear less regret and more these like kind of like fantastical ideas of like, if I hadn't gotten into a fight in the morning, or if I hadn't pushed my sibling on the way to school, my mom wouldn't have. died that day, or
Mm,
yeah, just kind of like kids will really look for cause and effect where there isn't one, because that again is a really natural response when we feel out of control. We want to find a way to be in control. Kids naturally have less control than adults. So, one way that they can assert that is by coming up with reasons for why things happen to them. And most of the time, those reasons are going to have to do with themselves, like
mm.
seeing them as the cause.
Yeah, well, we're meaning making machines, aren't we?
Yeah,
How do you,
absolutely.
yeah, how do you see how does that change maybe in like particularly sensitive or even like neurodivergent kids?
Mm,
We're in the time of rampant ADHD and all sorts of,
hmm.
neurodivergence and mental health issues and all that stuff. Do you see any common threads among that group?
Yeah, I think depending on like the type of neurodivergence we're talking about, if we're talking about ADHD for a moment, so we have someone with limited executive functioning skills, so already they're having a hard time like planning things, prioritizing things, and now when we have an extra stressor, there's going to be even less space in their mind for those kinds of tasks. So it would be really normal to see like more forgetfulness, more distractibility, more difficulty concentrating, struggling with transitions, and possibly having like more emotional dysregulation, so more of those like highs and lows. A lot of kids, neurodivergent kids too, like might struggle with sensory processing, and interoceptive awareness is our like one of our senses. It tells us how we're doing inside our bodies, and if you're not dialed into that, and it's like you can have kind of like low grade irritability build up over time. um, and so I think it's normal to see more like explosive behavior, or kind of being more, yeah, I guess like irritable. Would probably I'm going to land on that one a lot, because I think it's harder to put all of this into words, right? It takes insight,
Yeah.
awareness, and the ability to communicate how we're doing. And I think when we're talking about neurodivergent kids and youth, those three things are going to be a lot more challenging.
Yeah, and obviously we're talking broad strokes. It's different if you were like, "Oh, slightly on the autistic spectrum, parent died." Like if you gave some really specific
Hmm.
situational stuff, it might be easier for you to guide
Hmm.
us. So I know that generalizing is probably not super helpful in this context, but trying to pull out whatever common threads may exist. Um, in my experience, kids and a lot of adults have sort of unhealthy coping mechanisms, and in teens, just from the intimate conversations I've had with other parents and my own experience, extended family, um, controlling food restrictions, self-harm, these all seem to be some of the
Hmm.
I don't know, seemingly more rampant coping strategies. Do you have any like general tools for parents that are experiencing this type of behavior with their kids when it comes to processing a challenging situation?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I always recommend kind of getting connected with a therapist that you know and trust, whether it's, for the family, for you as a parent, or for your kiddo. But I think there's a lot that we can do to support kids that are going through that. So, based on some of the behaviors that you mentioned, I would conceptualize that and think about, well, this is probably a kid that is really feeling like I'm misunderstood, like nobody understands me, or nobody gets me, or this is all my fault, I'm the problem. So if we can identify like what that negative core belief is for that child, then it gives us a lot of inroads to support them with that. And I really encourage parents to lean into, I call it, well, I didn't come up with this, but it's called PACE. So being
Mhm.
playful, accepting, curious, and empathy. And so it's a way of talking to kids to let them know that no matter what's going on, we're there for them and we can help them through it. So, what that would look like in practice, like the acceptance is just being able to say, like, I get it. you know, this behavior really makes sense to me. Like, of course, you are having a hard time eating right now. I want to lean into that and say, yeah, I expect you to struggle with this. It takes away the shame that can show up with those kinds of behaviors. And I want to be empathetic. Like, you must be feeling really out of control right now, or you must be really sad. And then I'm going to be curious, what's been going on for you that you're finding it so hard to eat right now? So just like not attaching any outcome to that, but it's like, hey, like I really want to get to know you better and I want to understand what's going on for you. And we can be curious about cause and effect because kids don't have the same level of perspective that we have as adults, right? So you might even say something like, I know that dad died 3 years ago this week, and I wonder if you're also finding reminders of that, or whatever it is. Like we can help kids
Mhm.
connect the dots about, hey, this thing happened, this is how I'm feeling, and this is what I'm doing to try to feel better.
Mhm.
And then we can be there and like support them through those feelings, but without ever naming it, without ever naming like what's happening or um, understanding the why behind these behaviors, I think it's hard to resolve them.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting. So that curiosity piece would be like peeling back the layers to eventually end up at some core belief that is driving whatever
Yeah,
behavior. Yeah.
totally. Yeah, right. Like we might wonder, like, I wonder if you really felt like you were responsible for this, or, just being curious. And then once we can name it, then we can help kids process it and we can help them move through those feelings that are coming up.
Hmm. Cool. In our experience, and this was just through something we read, that teens typically tend to process grief and loss like much later. It's
Mm.
sort of like a delayed processing. Have you found that in your experience or from your training? Do you understand that to be the case? Or
I haven't like read any literature on that, but what you're saying just totally makes sense to me because
Mhm.
they're such strong protectors, right? Of like, I need to show that I'm okay and I don't want to let anyone in on this. I don't want to appear vulnerable. And I think that's just like a natural um, stage that teens go through. So it would make sense to me that teens would take a little time to be able to process some of this stuff and to allow themselves the time and space to really like acknowledge those feelings that are coming up around a loss.
Mhm. How do parents' behavior differ when it comes to like family loss? I know it's a very, very general question, but do you see particular trends in
Hmm.
parents, and are there any coping strategies that you would broadly recommend when the parents themselves might be grieving?
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I see a big trend, and it's a really healthy one, where parents are really being open about their grief experience and keeping memories of their loved one like front and center. So it could look like, hey, we're going to set another table or another setting at the table for, this person that passed away, or we're going to make sure that we talk about this person regularly throughout the day. So I would encourage parents to talk about it and be mindful of those milestones that kids and teens go through. So if we're talking about, loss of a loved one, like a parent or a sibling or someone like that, bring them up on those dates, right? So, hey, your kid is graduating. Tell them how proud their loved one would be about them. Say like, "Oh, I know
Mm,
that your mom would just be so happy to see you today." And I can just picture the smile on her face hearing, your report card mark or whatever it is. I don't mean to make this all about academics. It could be, small choices that kids are making in the day, but yeah, keeping that memory alive, I think is so important and just like normalizes those experiences.
mm. That's cool. So you're seeing a trend in more openness around this because I know culturally our conversations around death and the transitioning process and our, you know, It's something that's kind of relegated to the closet and traditionally isn't really talked about. But what do you think might be driving this conversation into more acceptable territory?
That's a really good question, and I don't have an answer for that. I don't know if it, yeah, like this is just totally guesswork, but I wonder if social media has played a role in it's like giving space to some of these ideas that we haven't talked about before that like, hey, it's okay to do this. It kind of gives people a platform to change those messages in society. I wonder if
Hmm.
could be a part of this, is just building that awareness and reducing some of the stigma about these conversations.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, I wonder about that too. Like maybe it's just a cultural shift as social norms have morphed, from
Hmm.
basically kind of the boomers on down, right? Things
Yeah.
do seem to be changing. Um, Kids, teens in particular, you said tend to put on this, strong front where they don't want to seem vulnerable. Are there any ways you could suggest parents approach difficult conversations with teens? Are there any like tools or
Hmm.
tactics that you find particularly effective?
Yeah. Definitely stay with the curiosity, but like, hold your ideas very lightly. So, you might be sitting in the car somewhere where you're side by side or not face to face. And you might just say, I noticed that you're kind of quiet today. I wonder if you're thinking about whoever the loss is. And don't expect a response. Just naming those, I wonder if that would make a lot of sense to me. And just there's a period at the end is I I wish, yeah, I wish that more parents could do that. And I understand how upsetting it can be as a parent when your kid's not sharing with you, and you can tell maybe that there's something going on for them. But the more questions that well, teens, I should say, the more questions they get about their inner world, I think can be it can just activate that shield even more of like, I'm fine, like a lot of teens are aware when their parents are worried about them. And so they, again, go into protection mode of like, I don't want my parent to worry, so I'm not going to go there. But yeah, I think just being curious and not expecting a response is a big tool to use.
Holding space with no expectations will get us
Hmm.
all pretty far, won't it?
Yeah.
Um, so culturally, I have observed that we really hide the process of dying and just transitioning, and seeing somebody you love in ill health is super hard. What's your opinion on kids being part of that sort of? I mean, if you're fortunate enough to have the gift of time to spend with a loved one before they pass, what's your opinion on
Hmm.
kids being a part of that process? And I imagine it's probably age related, but yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. I think it's really important. And yeah, it definitely does depend on what your cultural beliefs are. And for listeners out there, just for me to kind of socially locate myself, like I don't know, third or fourth generation Canadian, I'm white, and my parents' background is Western European. Um, so I'm going to have like different beliefs about what's appropriate for kids to be a part of than people from other cultural backgrounds. But I do know in my own experience, I lost my great grandfather on my mom's side when I was probably around eight-ish. I don't know. We'll go, early school age. And I didn't get a chance to be a part of the funeral. And I think my mom thought a funeral is no place for a kid, right? It's, kids are seen but not heard, and it wouldn't be appropriate for me to be a part of that. But I really did feel like that was a loss for me, and I I wanted to be a part of it, and it's so healing to be around family members and relations and friends when we're going through a loss. So I think it's important to include kids in that as much as possible.
Yeah, and I imagine that's even easier, say, for teens that have a little bit more emotional awareness and a bit more resilience. It's like, where's the line between potentially
Hmm.
putting like a younger child into a traumatic situation versus, um, yeah, teenager.
Yeah, and I think like your original question might have also been more about like how do we prepare kids for death or for
Hmm.
understanding that a loss could happen. And for young kids, that's not something that they can cognitively understand. Um, so being really simple, you might, if you know that there's, a death approaching, you can start to have conversations about, dad's body isn't working as well anymore, dad's sick, and then afterwards you might say, yep, dad died and his body stopped working. Just want to be really matter of fact and help kids know that there is, again, this is culturally specific, but know that there's a resolution, right? It's like, yes, because, and I'm thinking preschool age, kids
Hmm.
have a hard time understanding permanence and understanding what death means. Like it's so final, and there's no context for that at that age. And there's
Yeah.
no, yeah, it's like they just can't really make sense of that. Like, well, are they going to come back tomorrow? Or like, will I see, daddy next week? Those are totally natural, normal responses that young kids will have to a loss. So I think that's important to know too, because it can be pretty upsetting for a parent to have their kid ask those questions, because it can bring up all kinds of loss for the parent, right? That those memories and how do I answer this? And I thought we already had this conversation, so it can be kind of, yeah, it can be sensitive.
Yeah. How much better are teens at considering that permanence and having reflection? I mean, I think it's their frontal cortex is like isn't developed for until you're in your 20s or something. But
Yeah.
are they that much better equipped to navigate those things?
Yes and no, because teens teens can go the other way. This is a time of life when, we get really wrapped up in abstract thinking. Um, Teens absolutely, by now, like are concrete thinkers, so they know like, an end is an end, a death is final. But it brings up all these other abstract thoughts of what's going to happen to me, how will I die? Other people in my life are going to die. How can I know when they're going to die? So it can bring up all of these other questions about death that can be challenging to answer.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, most adults really don't pose those questions to themselves in a particularly meaningful way. It's like something that
Mm.
we would just rather not think about, even though we all know
Mhm.
it's coming down the road.
Mhm.
How has the work that you've done changed the way that you view or consider loss or even death?
I'm going to answer it in a probably a way that is unexpected. Um, I'm going to kind of jump on the first part of that question of like, how has it changed the way that I view loss? And it's made me really appreciate how many losses there are that are not death. So it could be loss related to moving schools. It could be loss related to, um, you know, losing a parent, being placed in foster care. They still have a parent in their life, but there's a real big loss there of I can't be with my parent. So I guess for me, it's helped me really see how many other types of loss there are, um, and how those kind of early losses can influence the way that we, attach meaning to things in our life. Like it can be a lot harder to deal with losing a favorite jacket if we have an unresolved loss of a relationship. Um, so does that make sense? Kind of
Oh,
that
interesting.
connection there?
Yeah. So there's an attachment to material things that are driven by some previous experience that wasn't processed or dealt with. Am I
Hmm.
understanding that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I think for the young people that I work with, sometimes they'll have like, it looks really unexpected reactions to having to give away things that should be kind of inconsequential. Like, let's say, like, a kid has a collection of like wrappers, like candy wrappers or something, and being told to throw that in the garbage, it leads to a meltdown. Or maybe their pockets always have things in them, and being asked to empty their pockets, it's like, I can't do that. And it's because it's like a nervous system response. It like reminds them of a time that they had to lose like a relationship. Maybe it was an absence of a parent for a period of time. But that it's the same emotion that gets activated in us of like I have to let go of this thing, and I don't want to feel that pain of being separated. It reminds me of that early separation. So I think that's often really misunderstood or not even really connected or talked about. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. No, that's great context. And what about has it changed the way that you think about like death for yourself or even in the way that you interact with your clients? Like how has your perspective on that changed throughout the work you've done? I'm sure you've managed to help people deal with a lot of loss.
Yeah. Has it changed my perspective of death? Oh, I wish I had that question in advance so I could really think on
Mm,
it because
that's
it's
okay.
it's
No, I
such
was
an
just
interesting question, and I want to like I'm like finding that like curiosity in myself. I'm like, oh, like I wonder, um,
mhm.
has that changed things for me? And I think I think maybe it's changed maybe not so much my idea of death, but like how to talk about death after it's happened has changed for me. So, like I mentioned, like I'm seeing a lot more families that are being really open about the losses that they've experienced and really honoring their loved ones' lives in their present day. So I find that very healing, and I think that is such a beautiful thing that I, want for my own life, to be able to keep those memories alive and keep that person alive for as long as we can. So maybe, yeah, it's more changed my idea of how to move forward from a death.
Mhm. It is interesting when I sort of prompt people with those types of questions. It gives you this, it's like a little uncomfortable, but it's also very thought provoking because it seems like this part of life that we just push off into a corner or like sweep under the rug. And
Hmm.
taking an intentional look at it, and I think my first exposure to this was through like, traditionally Buddhist spiritual practices where the the contemplation of your own mortality is like a very very um, core practice. And I
Hmm.
found it caused friction for me, but there was also something very explorative and very new and almost like encouraging to dive deeper into that. Like, what does that
Hmm.
process mean? What do I want my own death to look like? And how can I reflect on my own mortality in a way that drives me to live a more intentional, more aligned life now,
Hmm.
whatever that looks like? Uh,
Hmm.
I mean, that's probably the biggest shift I've had from losing my mom is like as soon as I found out she was terminal, my perspective just totally shift. The lens through which I looked at my life and evaluated my priorities just changed wildly.
Hmm.
And it can be very jarring to realize you feel like you are not the star of your own show in some way, and you just kind of rolled along with life and ended up in this
Ooh,
place you didn't intend. And now, you're kind of shaking the snow globe and figuring out how those snowflakes should fall. But
right. Yeah. Oh, I love that imagery.
yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Um, what happens within a family unit when adults avoid processing their grief? And maybe the adult takes on
Mhm.
that typically teen role of very strong front, not going to deal with it, just going to
Mhm.
soldier on, so to speak. What impact does that have on the family dynamic?
Yeah, I think it can really strain things in the family. it's very natural. Like there's a model of grief called the dual process model where it's like we recognize that it's normal to move from like loss oriented activities. So like focusing on the grieving, talking about the loved one, like putting like ritual around that, and future oriented or like restoration oriented activities where it's like, okay, well, what am I going to do next? And like you said, like I'm shaking the snow globe and I got to refigure this out and kind of move on with my life. And, does that mean I'm doing something different? Um, and am I putting all of my energy into what's coming next without looking back? And when the parent is so focused on like the future, and this could be future like, next day, next week. I'm not talking about, 10-year plans, but like when they're really not taking that time to allow the grief to be felt and processed as a family. I think that, especially with teens, you might see some resistance to that, more defiance, more angry. And I think that is a response to having those feelings not being honored and recognized by the parents. That it's like, hey, like it's like teens. I'm thinking teens in particular because I think I've seen this in my own practice very strongly, where the teens and the parents were like totally not in alignment with like how to grieve, and the teens reacted with a lot of anger because it's like, hey, I need you to put on the brakes, and I don't know what else to do to get your attention, right? And so being
Yeah.
angry is like, maybe that one of those ways of communicating that.
Dad, you're supposed to be upset. Why aren't you showing
Yeah,
it?
yeah, yeah, totally.
Yeah, I'd see that. Not to harp on all the dads out there, but, if we're gender
It's
norming for a
gendered.
minute.
It really is, and I'm glad you brought that up because it really is. And yes, not everyone falls into those gender roles, but it's more socially acceptable in our culture for men to be future oriented and for women to be loss oriented in their grief styles. And so,
Hmm,
yeah, those cultural norms can really influence how we grieve and how our grief reaction is perceived, supported, encouraged.
hmm, super interesting. Um, Early on, we talked about, the inner child, so to speak. How does unresolved grief and trauma tend to show up for is I don't know if this is even a fair question, but how does unresolved grief or trauma tend to show up in people's lives? Um,
Mhm.
yeah, maybe I'll leave it there.
Yeah. When we don't allow ourselves space to feel the emotions associated with a grief, we might sh- kind of shut down that part of ourselves so that whenever we get close to feeling that, we might instead feel anxious, we might feel angry, or we might do things not to feel that. So, we might be very focused on planning and prepping and being busy. We might use substances or alcohol or, um, I mean, any number of kind of coping behaviors, right? And that can work for a time. And I think when that's our only response to that unresolved grief, like we can kind of ping back and forth between feeling really like anxious, like, oh my God, is this bubbling up inside? And I need to dissociate from it or like avoid it. Yeah.
I'm laughing just because I resonate with a bunch of that personally. Um, so yeah, substance abuse was definitely a part of my younger years that took a lot
Hmm.
of I don't know, I guess effort to overcome.
Right.
And what I realized is that during that process, I learned to completely distrust my emotions. So when I
Hmm.
started feeling strong emotions, I just like swallow them and start to hyper rationalize in my mind. So rather than using substances or whatever the trigger was or the coping strategy was, it's like I've learned to disregard the feeling, the visceral physical feeling in my body, and overthink my way out of whatever emotion I'm feeling. And again,
Mhm.
forward thinking, yada yada. So yeah, that
Mhm.
that resonates with me. The therapist that I work with, she always pointed that out. She'd just be like, "You're doing it again," and she's like, "It's a very very strong defensive mechanism you've developed." So
Totally.
yeah,
Yeah. And like, I mean, it's adaptive at some point in time. Like we choose these strategies because that was the best choice available to us at that time when we started using those strategies, and they probably really worked in that moment. It's just as we grow older, right, we start to feel, well, maybe now I'm noticing I'm more numb or I'm more disconnected, or maybe I'm feeling too strongly, right? It's like, you can feel more
yeah.
like these ups and downs are overwhelming. So, yeah.
Yeah, for me, it's the numbness. It's like my emotional band is very small. It never gets very high, never gets very low, but I feel like there's a richness to my life that's missing from
Mm-hmm.
experiencing the peaks and the valleys that I imagine would offer a much more robust experience of my life. So it's something that I've been
Yeah.
personally trying to work on, is like pause and actually feel those
It's
feelings
okay.
and
Yeah.
see where they're coming up in your body and just sit and be with them without judging them. And yeah, just
Mm-hmm.
allowing them to sort of work through you, in
Work
an
for you,
effort
right? Like,
to yeah, in an effort to enrich my life
mhm.
experience. Yeah.
We have the word motion in emotion, right? It's like it's meant to move, and it can get really stuck if we don't allow that to happen.
Yeah, and actually maybe just an anecdote, but Tara Brock, I believe she's a psychologist and she used to be a monk, and she had a tool where when strong emotions come up, if you can actually identify them and name them internally, be like, "Oh, hey, anger," or whatever it is, just that identification and naming it as something other than yourself creates a bit of space so that you
Mm-hmm.
don't identify as the emotion. I actually
Mm-hmm.
found to be a really powerful frame, because then it's like you're almost in like a conversation with that feeling. It feels like there's a bit of space. And yeah, I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
personally found that really powerful. So if that helps anybody, then awesome. But
One of
do
the,
you have any tools? Yeah.
yeah, I was going to jump in there and say like one of my favorite things to experience with clients is, they might be able to say like, yeah, like I'm really angry, and when I invite them to acknowledge and make space with me to feel that anger, and I give permission, right, that I just want you to notice what that feels like in your body right now, and notice if it stays the same, gets bigger or gets smaller, and it doesn't matter what happens. I just want us to track that together, and it's 9 times out of 10 uh, people are surprised to say it went away, or it got smaller,
Mm,
or I noticed it changed. And that's not that, that's, I'm not attaching good or bad to that, because hey, if it gets bigger, awesome, let's stay with it and let's really figure out what that feeling is trying to tell us. But it's amazing to me that we can be so afraid of feeling these feelings, and then when we take that moment to pause and explore it, that it can just like soften. It's like, ah, I just want it to be named.
yeah. That's interesting. So in a culture where anger is not really a safe thing to express in a lot of circumstances, and I know I speak for myself, like largely, raised by a single mom through a bunch of my life, where um expressing anger didn't feel, I don't know what the right word is, but like what I've unpacked as an adult is that expressing my anger as a kid or as a teen just like wasn't an acceptable thing to display.
Hmm.
Have you seen that in others? Is that common? And are there any tools that you could suggest So for me, it
Mhm.
was sports, right? Like the only outlet I had were like action sports or like playing football or whatever it was, where you could, there was like safe
Mhm.
containers for that aggression to be expressed as like a young man.
Mhm.
Yeah. Anyway, maybe I'll stop there. Like, is that something that you see commonly? And do you have any recommendations on how, especially for young boys that don't have a healthy
Mhm.
outlet, how they might channel that? Or yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're an adult and you see this in a kid is like giving permission to be angry. And I want everyone listening to know that's not permission to be hurtful or dangerous with your anger, like to be violent with it, but it's, being able to say, like, I get that you're so angry right now, and that's okay. Like, I think young people, especially guys, need to hear that more, that it's okay to be mad about this. Um, because oftentimes anger will transform into sadness, like, especially with men, boys and men. It's more socially acceptable to show anger than sadness. And so sadness comes, it's like the wires get crossed a little bit. And it's like, first there's that I feel sad, and then, whoa, that's not safe to show. I got to be angry because that will push the sadness away. And that can work for a period of time, but long term, it's probably not a good solution.
Interesting. I experienced that in my own way after my mom passed, where I would start feeling super angry, which is again unsafe. So it's like I jump on the spin bike and just
Mhm.
go as hard as I could for
Mhm.
half an hour.
Yeah, I
And
love
then
that.
afterwards, I'd immediately be in a puddle of tears. Like that anger had just
Yes.
dissipated and it was just pure sadness. And
I
yeah,
love
you're right.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, but it is, you're right. Like, I mean, I know it's kind of a trope, but boys don't cry, that whole thing. You're not quote unquote supposed to show your emotions in that way by whatever social, training we
Mhm.
get when we're little.
Mhm.
But yeah, no, I had my own experience of feeling that anger and having it feel very uncomfortable because there's no real outlet for it, unless you're into combat sports or like jujitsu or something like that, where it's like
Mhm.
aggression is just integrated into the experience. Like there really are no containers, or very few containers
Mhm.
for men to dispel
And I
those
I love the
emotions.
awareness that you had into your experience of saying, like, recognizing I am angry. I need to do something to get rid of this energy, and I'm going to jump on the spin bike, which is very different from, like, that's like misdirected anger. And just hearing you say, like, combat sports, yes, can be an outlet for that, and it can also be a misdirected outlet if there's not that. I'm like, how do I word this? So when I say I'm going to back up. When I say misdirected anger, it's anger that we're not directing it at the person or the thing that we're actually upset about. We're directing it at someone else, or we're directing it inwards. And I think that some of those outlets, like, sports and things like that, they can become misdirected anger where, we're, taking it out on an opponent, but that's really not expressing it where it needs to be expressed, which is different from, I think, your experience of, like, I know that this is anger. I know this is, about losing my mom, and I'm really going to work through that.
Yes, and I guess if we're gonna harp on guys, right? Like the guys that have
Mhm.
healthier, and I'll put that in quotes, healthier
Mhm.
coping strategies tend to internalize that anger rather than
Mhm.
letting it out, right? Um, which can also be super like self-harming in a way,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So if other than physical activity, are there any other ways that you would encourage guys to help themselves become aware of those feelings and or
Mhm.
find a way to transmute them? I don't know if that's the right word, but yeah.
Mhm. Noticing it first, like taking that pause to really notice where you feel that in your body. What is that? So I don't know, there might be more awareness of anxiety or fear, right? That first I'm angry, but now I'm afraid I'm going to misdirect it at someone. Um, so taking that moment to reflect on what am I actually feeling? Is it in my chest? Is it in my arms? And allowing yourself to feel that is really big, right? That it's okay to feel that, and that allowing yourself to feel that is not equal to losing control and hurting people around you. I think that's often the fear that I see in the men that I work with, that if I allow myself to feel this anger, I could actually hurt someone with this. And I don't want that. And I'm going to avoid that, which can lead to bottling it up and until we can't bottle it anymore, right? So it can actually in the long run be even more hurtful to
Hmm.
loved ones.
Yeah, interesting. So separation or physical exertion to try and dull the intensity a little bit.
Hmm.
Interesting. Hmm. And what about kids that don't have the capacity for that kind of awareness? How might you approach them differently?
Hmm. I think it's really, really important for their attachment figure, like the adults, their primary adults in their life, to be that container for them. That it's so that kids know, just because I'm angry, like I'm not, I'm not going to lose the people that I need to support me in my life. So, I guess if we want to like kind of picture that, maybe we have a kid having a tantrum and we just have a parent there holding space with them, um, and showing them, once they've expressed that like, hey, I'm here, I can offer you a hug, I can offer you nurture, and I can offer you care. And we don't have to talk about what just happened right now. I think is a big piece. And I know it's a kind of a natural tendency that we want kids to learn from these moments. We want things to be teachable moments. But when we're trying to create a safe space for kids to know that it's okay to be angry, um, usually they need a lot of nurture and kind of support. And kids know, hey, I shouldn't have thrown that thing when I was upset. So the minute that we go into teaching and learning mode, it can just contribute more to that feeling of like, nobody gets me, I'm the problem, right? And we don't want that for kids. We want them to know that, like, I get you and I'm going to keep you safe.
Hmm. I hope this is related. So, when you talk about kids' attachment, is that related to the social media firestorm of attachment styles that has become like a surprisingly normal topic of conversation in our culture?
Yeah, when I use the word attachment figure, I think I probably just said.
Mhm.
What I mean is like, so it's a natural human tendency as we all form attachments like within our relationships. And this is actually like a biological need. So babies are very helpless when they're born. So they need to attach to a caregiver that can help them meet their needs to like regulate their temperature, make sure that they're fed, make sure that they are, yeah, it's like they're developing that sense of themselves. And we can't develop a sense of ourselves without another adult there. So
Mhm.
that's an attachment figure is that caregiver.
Yeah. And I guess that would be related to a lot of like Gabor Mate's work. Are you familiar with his
Mhm.
work?
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. Because he talks about attachment a lot and how that informs, I mean, really our trauma in a lot of ways and the relationships we had with those folks that we were attached to and what we did or didn't get from them
Mhm.
and the
Mhm.
impact that has. Yeah. Super interesting. Yeah, I took a left turn on the attachment styles piece because that's a very different conversation. But is there some validity to that in recognizing um, the attachment styles and or like love languages, so to speak, even with your kids and trying to interact with them in a way that feels more meaningful to them based on their tendencies?
Yeah, so I think it can be helpful to be mindful that our attachment styles will change depending on who we're interacting with and the situation. that we're experiencing. So a securely attached child knows I will be taken care of, I can trust adults, I'm lovable, I'm worthy. So in some ways, like, if you're working with a child who's pretty securely attached, it's probably going to feel kind of easy to support them through a loss. They're going to have the words to talk about their sadness. They're going to be accepting of your love and support um, as you move through that grief experience. If we're working with a kid who's insecurely attached, it means that this child has had times in their life where they didn't feel like they could depend on the adults around them, whether that's, because they felt like they had to take care of their parents to make sure their parents were safe, or whether they were fearful of their parent. Maybe they were using kind of harsh discipline, or it was, a low emotional warmth kind of household. And so now you have an insecurely attached child experiencing a loss. It's going to be a lot harder to soothe them. It's going to be a lot harder for them to trust that they can share about their experience with another adult, because there's been times in their life that adults weren't dependable or adults weren't safe. They weren't able to meet their needs. Um, and kids can cope with that by becoming very like avoidant or distant, almost like becoming the island of like, I don't need anything from anyone. They might yeah, hands up. They might go the other way where they're like very clingy. Or they could be a mix of both of like, I want you close, but now you're too close and I'm going to push you away. I'm going to, really become explosive. Oh, I lost your sound.
Sorry, the question was, yeah, around attachment styles. There's secure and insecure attachment styles. So there are other core attachment styles.
So that broadly, those would be the two types of attachments or attachment styles we can have. And then within an insecure attachment style, we can have like an avoidant attachment, an anxious attachment, and we can have a disorganized attachment, which is that push pull of like, I want you close, but I don't feel safe or comfortable with this level of intimacy, and now I'm pushing you back. And those can, yeah, it can make it really hard to help those kids and teens through challenging experiences like loss, because it's hard to know how to comfort them, and um, it's hard not to take it personally, right? When you see a kid is hurting and you offer, to care for them and they push you away or they're not reachable, it's hard. Our attachment systems as adults gets activated, and then it's really tricky.
100%. Yeah, there's a quote that really rings true for me, and it's like when they deserve it the least, they need it the most, right?
I
And
love
that leaning
that.
in, even when yeah, and even you just have to lean in so hard, and often you get nothing in return for that like
Mhm.
extra effort you put to leaning in, and you just have to be okay with that. And again, it's like the curiosity without holding expectations. Like, how can us
Mhm.
as parents do a better job of releasing our expectations of our kids and allowing them to have their own experience? Right? It's hard.
Mhm.
It's hard.
Sometimes
Yeah.
I find it's helpful to even visualize like that there's like a hard outer shell or a shield around those kids that push us away, and just to really picture like on the inside you could even see them as like them at a younger age and kind of know that they still have that like sweetness about them. I find that helpful, and I think some of the parents I've worked with have found that helpful, that it's like I can separate those two now. So
Yeah. Well, and I guess that's something that I have explored for myself through like a spiritual practice, is like seeing yourself as the other. If you had
mm.
lived that person's life under those conditions, like you would likely be the same. Um,
Oh yeah.
and being able to reflect that, like, I don't know,
Hmm.
yogic sort of like the light in me sees the light in you kind of idea, right?
Yeah, oh, that's such a beautiful practice to be able to really like empathize and make meaning or understanding of that.
And sometimes incredibly difficult. So maybe totally switching gears here. What are some of the things that you do to remain balanced that have like the greatest impact on like your inner world?
That's a
Like, do you
broad
use some of the
question.
frameworks and tool? Yeah, so like, do you use some of the frameworks and tools that you give to other people? Like, are you able to bring those into your own experience when you're feeling strong emotions or dealing with loss, whatever that might look like?
Hmm. Yeah, actually, so on my wedding day, that I really had to practice this idea of like it's okay to feel what you're feeling because I know it'll move through faster. I got really unexpectedly teary right before I was about to walk down the aisle. And I knew that if I walked down the aisle, I was going to be like lip quivering. And I just knew that state of like, that like when you're right on the tipping point and you're trying to hold back tears. I knew that was going to last through like the whole ceremony, and I was like, that's going to be really uncomfortable. So I had my wits about me enough to remind myself what I tell my clients, that like it's okay to feel that, and like actually gave myself permission to pause, and really like I let myself cry, and then I was like, oh, okay, I'm good. Like it took 30 seconds, and I walked on the aisle, and I think my husband is the one that broke down. And
So in all fairness, I was too. You know, my wife said that she had the extra motivation not to ruin her makeup, but I'm like reading my vows and just like, yeah, yeah, didn't make it, didn't make it through. So I can
right,
relate.
right. And did you find that about yourself of like, I'm not going to let this show?
Oh, well, I just didn't expect it. I was fine
Hmm.
until I started reading my vows, and then it just like there was nothing I could do.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, that was cool. Um, all of the things that you've experienced and all the people that you work with, have you found that changes the way that you interact with the world? Like how has the way that you interact with the world changed because of your training and your experience?
Hmm. How has the way I interact with the world changed? I think hope. I don't know. I show like a deep appreciation for kind of my everyday activities. I think like it's become a practice for me just to be able to acknowledge the things that really like I enjoy. Like I'm looking outside my window right now and I'm seeing like this beautiful tree with like yellow and orange leaves, and just being able to look at that and go, ah, yeah, like I give myself permission, I guess, to stop and take in the beauty around me, and to slow things down. And I think that comes with probably having more insight into myself, which is a natural thing as a therapist. Through my training and schooling, there's a lot of focus on, you know, what's happening internally. So
Hmm.
yeah, I don't know.
That's cool. That's something that I struggle with. I'm always deeply forward thinking, you know, long-term plans, lots of contingency plans, always fixated on the future, and just being able to take my foot off the gas and breathe a little bit and move through my life with a bit more grace is something that I'm very much trying to
Mm,
incorporate into my life. So being able to stop and smell the roses, so to speak, or
yeah.
reflect on the beauty of the tree, and yeah, spending a lot of time in nature really helps me to do that, but I'd like to be able to bring the
Hmm.
peace that I find in the forest to my day-to-day life, and I think there's a real grace in that. So
Hmm. And
hats off. That's one that I struggle with.
I'm just connecting that back to like, yeah, how does my profession, like what do I do for work, like influence that? And I have to be present when I'm with clients. And so, if present attention and mindfulness is like a muscle, right? Like I have to flex that. Um, so I think it probably does come a little bit easier where it's like, okay, well, I'm just here right now and I have to deal with what's in front of me, or,
Mm,
experience what's in front of me. But
I like that.
there's so many other professions and things that are so like focused on like future planning and quotas and like there is yeah, like a really
Most of
high
them.
intensity, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That was a big thing I realized in my perspective shift of losing my mom, was just recognizing that
Mhm.
the work that I was doing wasn't serving me and wasn't helping me to show up in the world the way that I would like to.
Mm.
And a big part of that was learning how to slow down. So it's something I've been trying to navigate, as what does
Mhm.
Matt 2.0 look like? Maybe as a final question, is there anything that you wanted to cover or that you hope that I would ask about that I didn't ask about?
Hmm. Isn't that just the famous last question? Um, Something that did kind of come to my mind is just how everyone's needs like are different when it comes to processing a loss. And for myself, like I think this conversation has really forced me also to kind of like examine what was my own experience of this and what was that like for me growing up. Um, I know that I had a loss when I was in high school of like a close friend, and um, I needed to talk it through when I was ready. That was offered to me when I was, when it happened, but I think I was 16 at the time and I was not ready. And then as an adult, I needed to be able to talk it through. And I found myself, in therapy, and therapists really wanted to help me resolve it by, using, therapeutic techniques that actually weren't talk based. And I really had to advocate and say, like, I need to talk. Like, I want you to listen. And um, so I think that's important too. And kind of connecting back to, how do we support kids and teens through this by creating those spaces to normalize these conversations. But this is just causing me to reflect on how valuable that is, like to have space to talk through what we're going through and what our experiences were like then and what's coming up now. Like, yeah, maybe I'm a verbal processor, but I
Hmm.
think a lot of folks benefit from that.
Yeah, I am for sure. I like to go into a hole and process it, and then I need to talk it through for sure.
Yeah.
Um, how do kids sometimes have an easier time talking to a stranger, a therapist, than they do to their own parents because of all of the context and history and trauma,
Mm-hmm.
not trauma, whatever that exists in those relationships? Is it sometimes helpful if your child is having, or maybe let's focus on teens because it seems more likely, but if your teen is just like totally shut down, how valuable is it to seek external help, sounding board, whatever that might look like?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that teens often really value having someone they can talk to that's separate from their family that it can just feel like that special relationship of like, I feel understood. I'm a family therapist, so I prefer to bridge that back to parents and support parents to be able to have those hard conversations.
Mhm.
I think it can be easier sometimes. You're causing me to reflect on like younger kids. Sometimes it looks like it's easier for younger kids to talk to a therapist. However, I think it's really the therapist being comfortable with the topic they're talking about. And I think kids want to have those conversations with parents. And
Mm.
yeah, so it's more, I think kids are open to talking about grief. I think they're open to talking about death. They just need to have an adult there that's comfortable with those conversations and creates a space to do that, whether it's, a therapist or a parent.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that those topics of conversation are becoming less taboo and that more families are open to having it. And obviously, it's a big part of
Mhm.
why this podcast exists, is just to normalize the conversations around it and understand how we can all navigate and contemplate the
Mhm.
end in a way that impacts our lives now. So, Dana, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure having you. you're registered in Alberta, so obviously your clients would have to be in Alberta, Canada. If
Hmm.
anybody wanted to track you down, how might they do that?
Yeah, you can find me at bumbleberrycounseling.com. That's my private
Okay.
practice. It's, yeah, counseling with two L's.
Okay.
Hmm.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate you coming
Yeah,
in today.
thank you.